What's really at play behind Israel threatening Türkiye, and how is that factoring into the war? Many assumed disagreement over foreign policy was to blame for Israel calling Türkiye the next Iran. But could the reality be simpler? As Ankara continues to support the prosecution of Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes and violation of international law, is Israel's right wing trying to smear an entire country and foment another conflict in retaliation? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. On Friday, Istanbul's public prosecutor announced an indictment against the Israeli Prime Minister and 34 other officials for crimes against humanity, torture, and genocide. That's on top of Ankara's support for the ICC's arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, plus its support for South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ. Now, it needs to be said that Türkiye and Israel have historically had very strong commercial and cultural ties, more so even than between Ankara and Tehran. But the treatment of Palestinians prompted Türkiye to take a strong position against Israel's right-wing leadership. And now it seems Israel is trying to hit back. Here's a look.
Repeatedly violating international rules, attacking regional neighbors, and unlawfully persecuting and targeting civilians. This is the Israeli government's notorious track record. Despite diplomatic efforts to end the war on Iran, Israel continues targeting Lebanon. More than 2,000 people have been killed and over 1 million displaced. Israel is also demolishing entire villages in southern Lebanon and expanding its occupation. Meanwhile, Tel Aviv is moving ahead with plans to grab more Palestinian land in the occupied West Bank. Despite the US-brokered ceasefire, Gaza still suffers under near-daily Israeli attacks. And in just the past year, Israel has also targeted Qatar, Syria, and Yemen. Last week, Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan called Israel's policies a driver of regional instability.
The truth that the international community must now clearly understand is this: unless Israeli expansionism ends, it will not be possible to build lasting peace, stability, and security in the Middle East. Israel's imposition of its own geopolitical calculations in the region through external interventions must be stopped.
But the growing opposition to Israel's actions and support for the plight of Palestinians has only led Israel to ramp up its threats towards Türkiye. Recently, Turkish local prosecutors charged Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and 34 others over the raid on the global Sumut flotilla last year. The indictment seeks life sentences for each suspect for crimes against humanity. That has prompted Netanyahu and his defense minister, Israel Katz, to take to X to attack Türkiye and its president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And Ankara has hit back. The head of Türkiye's communications directorate highlighted that with an international arrest warrant hanging over him and becoming more isolated, Netanyahu is acting out of desperation. And many see Israel's rhetoric towards Ankara as a fear of Türkiye's growing rule in the region and beyond. And some Israeli politicians have even explicitly expressed that. Israel's former Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has claimed that Türkiye and Qatar are trying to grow their regional influence, even describing Türkiye as the new Iran. Despite these false claims, as a NATO member, Türkiye remains a crucial actor for regional security. A recent air defence deal between Türkiye and the UK was hailed as reinforcing the alliance's capability in its eastern flank. Ankara has also repeatedly pushed for a peaceful resolution to conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, and lastly, Iran. Israel and Türkiye are clearly in conflicting positions from Palestine and Syria to the Mediterranean and beyond. Türkiye's foreign minister says Tel Aviv may be seeking to portray Ankara as a new adversary because it cannot sustain itself without an enemy. And that could add a dangerous layer to the Israeli threat to the entire region.
Now add all of that to inflammatory reports circulating on social media saying Turkey is preparing to invade Israel. Ankara has not only debunked those claims, but says Turkey has always prioritized peace, international law, and diplomatic channels, pursuing an approach that de-escalates tensions. So, joining me now to look further at this relationship are in the studio, Professor at the National Defense University, Huseyin Alptekin; from Washington, former senior U.S. diplomat and professor at the School of International Service at the American University, William Lawrence; from Boston, public policy fellow at American University of Beirut, Rami Khouri; and from Tel Aviv, political analyst and contributor to Haaretz, Akiva Eldar. Thanks all so much for being with me. I'll begin in the studio, Huseyin, and first have you explain why you think Israel is using such contentious language, saying that Turkey is the new Iran.
I think there are two reasons for that. For one thing, I think Israel feels itself very, very vulnerable. I think it sees pretty much every development in the region as a security dilemma. So if Turkey is investing in its defense sector, if Turkey is cooperating with Syria or with Saudi Arabia or with some other regional country in terms of their security needs, then Israel automatically almost sees this development as a threat to itself. So that's one reason. So anything, even a sunny day in Turkey, that might be, perceived as a threat by Israel. Their threat threshold is very, very low in that regard. And secondly, I think it's a multi-theater thing, because Turkey and Syria are developing very good relations, and Turkey has some other bilateral relations in the region, and I think Israel sees itself sort of left out in those networks, and I think there are some other side effects of what Turkey is doing with other countries in the eyes of the Israeli officials, which might affect them. It might be about Syria, it might be about Lebanon, it might be about even Eastern Mediterranean Sea. So I think it's not just about what's happening in Israel.
Okay. William Lawrence, let me turn to you. I mean, how does it actually serve Israel to escalate its rhetoric this way, especially when Israel has had a historically much better relationship with Turkey than any other country in its very own neighborhood?
Well, I think this happens on many levels, but for me, the Netanyahu government and the way that it goes about governing in alliance with all of its many characters, let's say, on the Israeli right, is always to play divide and conquer. So whether it's dealing with the Arab opposition within Israel, the Israeli opposition, the Americans and others, Turkey and its neighbors, all along its seven-front war. I don't know whether it's always deliberate or just lazy, but Israel always tries to turn potential allies against each other. And now that what the Shia axis of evil has sort of weakened on its front lines, it's imagining a new Sunni front aligning against it all across those seven fronts. And it sees Turkey right at the center of that. And so its only play, it feels, is to divide Turkey against others. So whether it's trying to divide Turkey from Syria or Turkey from NATO or Turkey from whoever else Turkey is working with, it's always going to play that same game where it tries to weaken the opposition by stopping any unified response to it.
Okay.
In terms of the escalation itself, there's, of course, domestic last point, a domestic aspect and an international aspect. So we always have to look at how internal rhetoric plays in terms of Israeli elections and domestic politics.
Also, William, very quickly, I mean, is there simply that kind of personal issue as well, with Turkey really pursuing international law and the prosecution of specifically Netanyahu and his right-wing cohorts there? They have these cases pending, and they support the other international cases that are going at the ICC and the ICJ. Does Netanyahu take that kind of personally, as well as his, Yoav Gallant and the others?
He takes everything personally, as your other guest said, in terms of the vulnerabilities as well. And he takes everything as a personal affront. And so, yes, I mean, it's all part of the same mix of threats against Israel, those deep wounds that the Israelis have legitimately and in a sort of trumped up way to justify its actions. So yes, and it sees all of these international law actions as fundamentally anti-Semitic and not acts of international law, which they are, and it's well documented in international courts and procedures and under the international law system, which is so weakened more than anything else by what the Israelis do.
Okay, let me get Akiva's opinion then out of Tel Aviv. And if you could also address how it's particularly tragic for Israel, because this is the one partner of sorts it did have in the region, because there have been such historically strong ties and a very prosperous trade relationship previously between Ankara and Israel.
So talking about dividing between Israel and Ankara, I would suggest to divide between the personal and the regional approach. I think it's not just a matter of Netanyahu against President Erdogan. Israel had good relationships still, when Erdogan was around. I really believe that Netanyahu feels that Turkey doesn't like him, but also that Turkey is an enemy. And why is it so? In the views of this government, and I want to divide between the people of Israel and this government.
Absolutely.
The people of Israel love Turkey. We love to travel to Turkey, and the Turkish people love the Israelis, especially when they come to visit and they spend their money there. And we had good strategic relationship, the two countries. What Netanyahu wants is to divide between the Palestinian conflict and the Israeli bilateral relationship with Turkey, and not only with Turkey. And I believe that things are going to change after what happened yesterday in Hungary. I think that Israel lost its gatekeeper in the EU that was there to stop any suggestion of sanctions against Israel. And what Netanyahu said at the UN few days before the terrible massacre that happened in October 23, he said that the Abraham Accords prove, and the message to the Palestinians is this proof, that they don't have a veto over peace in the Middle East. And the proof is now, and I think that Turkey is not willing to join any kind of regional truce, any alliance with Israel in the cost of the Palestinian conflict, and to just ignore it. Like the Emirates, Bahrain, and other countries were doing. Turkey sees itself, as Netanyahu said just few days ago, that Israel is a regional superpower, if not a global superpower. Okay, I think that Turkey is a little bit stronger and bigger than Israel, and some kind of, it's a kind of a message to Turkey, you better join us because we are a superpower.
Okay. Rami, let me ask you then, how specifically is Netanyahu and those on the extreme right responsible for this tension between Israel and Turkey? If this coalition specifically, Netanyahu's coalition, weren't at the helm, would Israel and Ankara and the world, for that matter, be where it is right now?
I think we can blame many things on the current government in Israel and the right-wing movement, which has taken over the government and the armed forces and many other dimensions of society. But you have to remember that, as you mentioned, Israel and Turkey had very good relations back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. There was trade, they had a lot of things going on. And it's been on and off even with Erdogan, hot and cold. But the main reason, I think, that the tensions now exist between Turkey and Israel is that Israel does not want any of the few genuine, strong indigenous states in the Middle East, and that includes Turkey, Iran, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt. Those are the only four really indigenous, strong, powerful states, or potentially powerful. Israel doesn't want any of them playing any significant role in anything other than supporting Israel. And the key, I think, in Turkey's situation is that it's involved in what the Israelis considered audacious and immediately killed off, which was an independent monitoring role for the ceasefires that happened between Palestinians in Gaza and Israel. The monitoring role was very short-lived, but Turkey was deeply involved with that, as were some other Arab and non-Arab countries. And Israel doesn't want anybody to do anything related to Israel's relations in the region other than the United States, because it feels it can pretty much shape American policy in almost all arenas. It wants the U.S. to remain the only external player.
Interesting. If we can now, I'd like to turn to the conflict in Iran. Huseyin, I'll bring it back to you. In Iran and the Gulf, you know, where Turkey is saying it wants to see an international force patrol the Strait of Hormuz, arguing it shouldn't be up to the United States or Iran, for that matter. Is it realistic? I mean, it sounds like a win-win. It would be fair in this multilateral world that more and more leaders are calling for. That would be a feasible solution.
It is very realistic, but unfortunately, the world we live in is very surreal. So I think the realistic calculations, the rational evaluations do not perfectly align with the realities we see on the ground. So what we see now is not a win-win situation, but it looks like America and Iran, they are escalating. It is to a lose-lose game. And both sides are losing. They have lost quite a lot in terms of human lives, in terms of economic cost. And I think the escalation will go on for the foreseeable future. Because on the one hand, the United States is starting this naval blockade as a response to the Iranian selective blockade of the Gulf. But on the other hand, Iran has proven that they have a very high threshold for absorbing pain in this war. And the United States, they are willing to inflict more and more harm on Iran, but in turn it backfires, because when you blockade such a significant choke point for the global economy, what happens at the end of the day? It creates an economic decline, a global recession, and eventually this kind of global economic downturn affects the United States more than any other country in the system.
Yeah, William, as far as blockading the strait is concerned, as well as the other fronts in this kind of multi-pronged conflict now outside of the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, how thinly can the U.S. and the Israeli militaries really spread themselves? We have to remember that there are not just multiple fronts active right now, but Trump is still threatening to go into Cuba, to take Greenland. He says that's not a joke. He hasn't forgotten. So really, militarily, what is the capacity here? Are they spreading themselves too thinly? And could that be the final end to this conflict?
Well, on Israel, I think they're less able to spread than the U.S. is. And on that seven-front war, I don't think they can really concentrate on more than 2 or 3 of the fronts at a time, which is why these pushbacks against Israel that lead to ceasefire actually serve Israel's interests, in that they can go focus on another front, you know, whether it's Lebanon or the West Bank or whatever, as they move their forces around to adjust to whatever opportunities they have to dominate in a sub area, a sub region, while they can't move forward as they always are doing on all of these other fronts. In terms of the U.S. spread, it's so interesting that the delay of the attack on Iran had to do with transferring forces from Venezuela, and the latest delay of the buildup of ground troops was about transferring forces from East Asia, because even though the U.S. does have a massive global reach and larger than any other country in the world by, an order of magnitude, it still can't do everything everywhere all at once, and it significantly weakened itself in East Asia and in the Caribbean for any other actions it may want to take. But quoting former Secretary of State Blinken yesterday, I think the major checks on U.S. actions right now are munitions and markets. munitions in that the defense of the frontline Gulf states and all these other states, when the retaliatory attacks come, those munitions are wearing thin and can't defend everything all the time, which makes everyone more vulnerable. And then the markets. Trump's action of a blockade against a blockade is going to be horrible for international markets. And the pressure of all of the world's leaders calling Trump and saying, cut this out, is going to happen very quickly.
Akiva, as for the Israeli part in this, how much more can the Israeli military do?
Well, first of all, I would like to remind you what President Trump said. He said, either way, if there will be an agreement, if the negotiations in Pakistan will be successful or not, we win. I think that whether there is an agreement or not, Israel is losing. And Israel is losing the international support. President Trump has leaked to the New York Times the full story, how Netanyahu manipulated him. And the international community, I would even say that the majority of the Israelis who are reading newspapers like Haaretz and are not just watching television to see the daily message that Netanyahu is putting online, they really believe that Israel is responsible and not Trump, that the tail was wagging the dog, and the fact that the American people have to pay more money to fill up their cars. I mean, thank you, Mr. Netanyahu, for doing this. They know that they have a weird, I mean, the least to say, a weird president, and that as Netanyahu convinced him to pull out from the quite reasonable agreement on the nuclear issue in Iran, he manipulated President Trump again. So the bottom line is that strategically Israel is losing. And now we are in the midst of the battle of the narrative. And Netanyahu is feeling that he's losing the people, and the polls are showing that the countdown to the end of his regime, maybe he sent his son, another mistake, to support Orban, that he will be the next one to go.
All right. Rami, then final question for you. As far as Lebanon is concerned, how determined is Israel then to continue its war on Lebanon, and to what end? The Lebanese and Israeli leaders are supposed to meet in Washington on Tuesday. How much are their negotiations coordinated with what's happening over Iran?
Like much of what the United States and Israel do together in the region, this is slightly delusional, but also slightly tactical. The Israelis are desperate to have, as Akiva noted, they're having problems. They feel that many feel they're losing, and they need to show some victory. They need to show some success. So do the Americans. Of course, in the American case, Trump just makes it up, says we've won, we've done this. For the Israelis, the talks in Washington are really significant symbolically, but in practical terms, they have very little impact. Two ambassadors talking to each other with the United States is not going to get very far, especially because it's the United States that's the mediator. The United States has shown in the last 2.5 years of genocidal assaults and wars across the region that it will support Israel fully without any serious questioning. And you can't have the U.S. be the mediator as well as an active participant in these wars. So I don't see these as very serious. And also they're hugely threatening to the internal stability and cohesion of Lebanon, which is already thin in many cases, but still it's there. The Lebanese, about 75–80% of Lebanese don't want to recognize Israel or have normal relations with it until the Palestine issue is resolved and the Israelis stop attacking Lebanon. And keep in mind that the early Zionists, Ben Gurion and others, 100 years ago, mentioned the South Lebanon as part of Greater Israel, that they should have it included for water and biblical and other strategic reasons. So the Israeli threats to Lebanon are not new. They're not really about Netanyahu. They're about Zionism, and Zionism remains the driving force of many of the conflicts in the region, which have expanded beyond Palestine, Israel, to Syria, to Lebanon, to Iraq, and now to Iran. And so we've got to deal with contained, defined Zionism in a way that's not aggressive and threatening, and lets everybody in the region live with their sovereign rights in a peaceful way.
Yeah, you don't.
Rami, most Israelis, including myself, that I consider myself Zionist, have no appetite to take Beirut.
Huh. Okay, let's hope that's the pervasive then feeling, I guess, among other Zionists. But unfortunately, we're going to have to let that be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all four of my panelists so much for being with me, and our viewers, of course, for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.